former All-American college football player who played for one of those Woody Hayes, Bear Bryant kind of coaches. And he went and played professionally in the NFL for some time, and when he retired from the NFL, he went back to his alma mater, went back to the college where he had played, and this old veteran coach was still there. And he was hired as an assistant coach for a brief time. And one of his main responsibilities was to scout and recruit players for that college. And so he was getting ready to make his first recruiting trip, and before he went into the office of that old coach, and he said, Coach, I want to make sure that I'm heading out on my first trip knowing that we're on the same page. So tell me, Coach, what should I be looking for when I'm out scouting and recruiting? And that surly old coach leaned back in his chair, and he looked the young coach straight in the eyes, and he said, Son, I've been at this job for a long time, and over the years I've noticed there are several different kinds of players. For example, you'll find some players who get knocked down, and they stay down. We don't want that kind of player. Next, he said, you'll find some players who get knocked down, they get right back up, they get knocked down again, and then they stay down. That's not the kind we want. And then the old coach said, but you'll also find some players who get knocked down, and knocked down, and knocked down again. And every time they get knocked down, they get right back up. And at this point, the younger coach, the assistant coach, got excited. He said, now, Coach, that's the kind of player we want, right? The old coach said, no, we want the one doing all the knocking down. Would it surprise you if I were to say that that's what God needs on our church team? Players to do some knocking down, not other people. That's why Pastor Kyle did not play Red Rover up here. God is not looking for players on his team to knock down other people, but to knock down walls. God's looking for players who will knock down the walls of hostility. God's looking for players who will knock down the walls that divide and estrange, walls that separate or alienate. We in the church, as God's people, are called to knock down walls of hate and hostility, walls of prejudice and judgment, walls of pride, walls of vengeance. And instead, we are called to build bridges of reconciliation. We are called to build bridges of love. We are called to build bridges of acceptance. That's what this passage from Ephesians 2 is really about. Listen to this lofty statement, this wonderful, great testimony of the Apostle Paul. He said, for he himself is our peace, meaning Jesus Christ. For he himself is our peace, who has made the two one, meaning Jews and Gentiles, who has made the two one and has destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility. That's what Christ can do. That's what Christ does. That's what the Prince of Peace, whose name we bear as Christians, the Christ whom we worship, that's what he can do if we let him work through us. This is what God sent him to do through us. This is what God calls us to do. This is what God, his Father and our Father, calls us to do. To save others that others might think are, let me say that again in a way that you'll get it better. To save others that others might think are beyond his power to save. To break down the walls so that all who believe can be reconciled to God, and to unify us as members of God's family. One family. The Apostle Paul said, one family. And we need this as much today as did those Jews and Gentiles back in Jesus' day. Those Jewish converts, like John said in the intro to the Ephesians passage, those Gentile, the Jewish converts rather, were very prejudiced against the non-Jews who were coming to Christ. Because they didn't have to be circumcised, They didn't have to go through all of the ritual stuff that all the old order Jews had to go through, and they felt it wasn't right, because the old order Jews who were converts to Christianity felt like they had paid their dues, and these new Gentile converts were getting off cheaply. Jesus said that's just not the case. All are one, Jew or Gentile, are one in the family of God. We need this message today as much as did those Jews and Gentiles back then. In fact, we need it today as much as humankind ever has, because we continue to live in a divided world. There are a few of you here today who lived through World War II. There are more of you who lived through the Korean conflict. There are more of us who lived through the Vietnam era. There are many of us who have lived through the Persian Gulf conflicts. And do we see anything getting better? God's world is still divided, and it always has been. We need this word more than any other time before. Nations are divided. Communities are divided. Families are divided. Even some churches are divided. Christians are, within the realm of Christianity, Christians are still fighting battles that have lasted for centuries. Battles between liberals and liberalists. Battles between social activists and right-wing evangelicals. Battles between modernists and traditionalists. And these aren't just interdenominational differences, like between UCC and other denominations. There are also walls within our denominations and within our local churches. A cartoon in a clergy magazine pictured a pastor sitting in his office with two obviously agitated parishioners. And the pastor was counseling them. It was obvious it was that situation. And the pastor in the caption was saying, with the current hard feelings that you two are expressing toward one another, would either of you object to my praying with my eyes open? How sad to see congregations and members of the same church divided like that. Nations, communities, families are divided. Some churches are divided. But as I said, into such a world comes our Lord Jesus Christ. And that's why this idea of resurrection is so wonderful in my theology. Because the resurrection of Christ comes to resurrect relationships all the time. The resurrection of Jesus was not just a one-time thing on the first Easter morning. Resurrections happen all the time. And he constantly comes into our world to resurrect relationships. Listen again to the words. For he himself is our peace, who has made the two one, and has destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility. And so I would ask you today, is there a dividing wall of prejudice in your life? Is there a dividing wall in your family, in your community? How about a wall in your heart? Have you built a wall to keep some people out? Jesus is a wonderful example on so many levels. And in this case, he saw the walls of his day, and he wanted them down. Walls between fallen humanity and God. Walls between the holier-than-thous and the sinners. Walls between Jews and Gentiles. Walls between Jews and Samaritans. Walls between the acceptable and the unacceptable in society. And he gave his life to tear those walls down. But again, sadly, not much has changed since then. Discrimination and prejudice are evident because of gender, because of race, because of nationality, because of sexual orientation, because of age, because of physical attractiveness, you name it. We are labeling kind of people. We're quick to label people. Because labels, you know why we do that as human beings? Because labels are convenient mechanisms for dismissing people we don't like. It's easy for us to categorize people and then put them in a box, in their place, we think, in their place. But who gives us the right? Labels are used to make people feel good about themselves and bad about others. Labels are used when you have a speck of sawdust in your eye, or in something, you see a speck of sawdust in someone else's eye, and you have a plank in your own. That's what Jesus was talking about. Labels are used when we don't agree with other people, when we don't want to get to know other people, and we conveniently place them in a box. But Christ challenges us. Christ challenges us to question our distinctions, our labeling, our divisions, our discrimination. He calls us to change. He calls our hearts to be open. Now, part of the good news about this is that you do not need to be the divine Son of God for this to happen. This is not just a Jesus-qualified thing. Christian men and women, and young men and women, and boys and girls, Christians of faithful intent and Christians of goodwill can be determined to do this. Let me tell you about one such man, and I'm going to speak to some of you who are die-hard Cleveland Indians fans, because you may remember the name of Joe Gordon. Any of you remember Joe Gordon? Played on the Cleveland Indians back in the day. In 1947, Joe Gordon was one of the top players in his prime with the Indians. And that same year, in 1947, a young black athlete named Larry Doby came to play on the Indians. And he was the first black player in the American League. He was understandably tense and nervous when he stepped up to bat for the first time. 3 pitches, swung 3 times, missed all 3 by 2 feet. Walked back to the dugout with his head down. Walked past all the other players on the bench, went to the end of the bench, slouched alone in the corner of the dugout with his head in his hands. Joe Gordon was the next player up. The opposing pitcher that day was a pitcher that Joe Gordon usually hit pretty well. But this time Joe Gordon went up to the plate, swung at the first pitch, missed it by 2 feet. Swung at the second pitch, missed it by 2 feet. Swung at the third pitch, missed it by 2 feet. Returned to the dugout, walked past all the other players on the bench, went down to the end of the dugout in the corner where Larry Doby was sitting, sat down next to him, put his head in his hands. Didn't say a word. But that message spoke volumes to Larry Doby. No one ever asked Joe Gordon if he struck out deliberately. But as long as they played together after that, every time Larry Doby went out onto the field, he first picked up Joe Gordon's glove and tossed it to him as a favor. Every time. Larry Doby went on to become one of the strongest players in Major League history. Went on to manage the Indians for a time, I believe. There comes a time when we are called to do the Christ-like thing. There comes a time when we are called to make a stand, to break down the wall, to conquer the hostility. Those walls that we build up around in our own hearts, walls that separate us from one another, walls that separate us from God. No matter where those walls may be. And the cross, once an instrument of death, once an instrument of execution, once an instrument of torture, the cross becomes the bridge between us and God. And it becomes a bridge of understanding between us and others. Not just in its symbolism of our Christian faith, but in its physical symbolism. If you've been around here a little while, you've heard me mention this before. Because one beam of the cross points to God and bridges that gap between us and heaven. And the other bridges the relationship between us and other people on earth. The cross is a wonderful symbol on many levels. In light of the age-old tensions in the Middle East, this next story is appropriate to illustrate this. A few years ago in Israel, the family of a Jewish man with a fatal was put on a donor transplant list. He would die if he did not get a new heart. And the family pleaded with the family of a brain-dead Arab man who was shot in the head by Israeli soldiers to donate the dying Palestinian's heart for the transplant. And the Palestinian's family refused. Both men died. Later, another Arab and another Jew lay dying in a hospital. This time the brain-dead man was an Israeli soldier shot by Arabs in the Gaza Strip. The man who needed the heart was a Palestinian. The Israeli family, unaware of the identity of the recipient, gave consent. The transplant took place in a Jerusalem hospital. When the news broke of where the heart had come from, there was a storm of protest. Israelis were enraged that the heart of their soldier was in the body of a Palestinian. Ironically, the man who actually received the heart went into hiding to escape the rage and the labeling of fellow Arabs. The widow of the dead Israeli soldier, however, knew the love of God. She also knew the words of Jesus. She was satisfied, and she said, if a person can be saved through my husband's death, I don't care who it is, I feel it's a blessing. A wonderful story. It is a blessing. One more wall broken down, and a bridge of love and understanding was built. This is also an illustration of one last lesson from our text, and then I'll be done. With the breaking down of the walls that separate us, then Christ's role changes. He calls us to break down walls, but instead of just being the wrecking ball that breaks down the walls that separate human beings from each other, Christ then becomes the glue that holds us together. Christ becomes the glue that holds us together, despite our differences. Near the end of our passage, we find these words, in him the whole building is joined together. Again, some of us are old enough to remember, but I can remember Ronald Reagan, President of the United States at the time, in Berlin, Germany, saying, Mr. Gorbachev, knock down this wall, or something to that effect. Tear down this wall, I think were his words. That was over 25 years ago when the Berlin Wall finally did come tumbling down. But there are still other walls to go. And glue that still needs to be applied in our world, in our nation, in our communities, in our churches, in our families. Walls to be torn down, and the love of Christ as the glue to bind us together as one family. Walls to be broken down. Can I give you a hammer? Can I give you an axe? Can I give you a bulldozer? Have you signed your letter of intent to play on the Lord's team? To be a player who breaks down walls? Then I can sell you some stock in the strongest glue in the world. It's called the love of Christ. Or maybe you're one of those who has built a wall around your own heart. If Christ has never broken through that wall,